Welcome to another podcast of What's Doing. I'm going to start with the words of the great writer and humanitarian Mitch Albom. I would caution young journalists not to succumb to this mentality that's out there right now that basically says, if you're not screaming, you're not doing your job. And if you're not angry, you're not doing your job. If you're not putting somebody down or blaming somebody, you're not doing your job. That's bull, and I'm sick of seeing it happen to good, smart people. Welcome, Mitch Albom, everyone. The author of numerous books. He sold 40 million books, and he has his new bestseller, which is out now twice. Mitch, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Kevin.
Mitch, my father used to say, a guy dreams of being like you. Go write a big book, run from the newspaper, have a big bestseller, and never look back. Meanwhile, you stay at the Detroit Free Press all these years. What keeps you writing columns?
Well, several things, Kevin. I mean, the book you're referring to was Tuesdays with Morrie. Tuesdays with Morrie was an accident. I wrote it to pay my old professor's medical bills. When I tried to find someone interested in publishing the story of an old guy talking to a young man about what's important in life as he's dying, everybody told me to take a hike. They weren't interested. It was boring. I was a sports writer. I couldn't write it. We only found one publisher who was willing to publish it 3 weeks before Morrie died, and they gave us just enough money to pay his bills, which is what I did, and I wrote it, and I thought I'd go back to sports writing. So I wasn't doing what your dad predicted. I wasn't like, oh, this is going to be a huge hit, and it's going to be my ticket out of newspaper writing. Actually, it wasn't supposed to be a big book at all. I mean, they only printed 20,000 copies. I thought I'd have them in the trunk of my car for the rest of my life and give them out to people when they walked by. So when Tuesdays with Morrie became this, unexpected bestseller and kept going and kept going and kept going, I had to do a lot of exploration as to why it was and what I didn't plan on it and what did it mean to my life. And what happened was the focus on me shifted from being a guy with, just another loudmouth sports writer to somebody who might have something to say about life and about charity and about family and about relationships. And, I stopped getting recognized in airports for ESPN, where people would just say, who's going to win the Super Bowl? And you just say Patriots and you keep walking. And then all of a sudden people were coming up to me and saying, my mother died of cancer, and the last thing we did was read Tuesdays with Morrie together. Can I talk to you? And you can't say Patriots and keep walking. You've got to stop and listen. And I stopped and listened, not tens or hundreds or even thousands, but tens of thousands of times since then, to people's grief stories, to what they're really going through in their life. And I came to realize that the newspaper was a potential vehicle for me to write that kind of thing on a day without having to put a book out about it, which takes you, a couple of years to put together. I had a format on Sundays that they let me pretty much write whatever I wanted, not sports. And I've been able through that to build a lot of charitable work here in Detroit and to be connected to the community at moments like 9/11 and, other kind of, community shaking or country shaking sort of things. So, I just didn't feel like I was cashing my golden ticket. That was never my intent. And, they took a chance on me when I was very young, and I don't feel like turning my back on them. So I still write for the newspaper, although if I'm being fair, my life isn't really newspaper work predominantly, probably 50% of my life now.
You started like my father. He started in sports. He told me, you got to go to the loser's locker room. That's
right.
where he found the stories.
100%. Losers are always much more interesting than winners. Best story I ever wrote in sports, I thought, and a column that's probably gotten more attention than any column I've written. I was at the Olympics in 1992, and I went to the stadium to see Carl Lewis run the 100 meters. Now, that was the biggest event for the biggest star of those Olympics, right? So that's the opposite of what your father was saying. That's the winner with the glory. But I went there so early to try to get a seat that I was there by about like 3:30 in the afternoon. The race wasn't until 8. So I'm sitting in a half-empty stadium, and they're running these heats of the 400 meters, preliminary heats with the guys who are never going to make it to the finals. And they shoot the gun off, guys start running around, and one runner pulls up lame in the lane and drops to the ground, and his race is over. He pulled a hamstring or something. And everyone else finishes, and he's on the ground. He starts to cry. And, this happens all the time in track and field, but all of a sudden, this guy comes out of the stands. This heavy-set guy comes running out of the stands and onto the track and grabs this guy and lifts him up and starts walking him in his lane around the track. I would later come to understand that if you don't finish your race at the Olympics, you're not recorded as having participated. But if you finish, even if you finish 3 minutes behind everybody who took 10 seconds, you're in the books. You're in the books as dead last, but you're in the books. And he walks him around and he puts his feet on his feet. And so they're kind of walking together. And by the time they come around the bend, everyone's like, come on, yeah, clap. So they come across the line. And now, if you tell this story about this guy named Derek Redmond, there'll be 1,000 reporters who will say that they were there. I'm telling you, I was actually there. There were 5 of us, 5. And we ran downstairs to the tunnel. And I saw the runner himself, Derek, but I saw the other guy, and he was the guy I wanted to find out the story. And I ran up to him. I said, "Who are you?" You ran onto the tracks. He said, "I'm his father." And I said, "You're his father?" I said, "What made you run out of the stands?" He said, "Well, I know how hard he trained, and I know what he put into this, and I couldn't bear to see my son crying. And so I came around, and I just had to help him. I know I'm not supposed to. I'll probably get in trouble." And I said, "Why did you hold him the way that you did?" He said, "Well, I taught him how to run. And when he was a little boy, that's how I taught him how to run. I put his feet on my feet and I taught him how to run." And here he was doing it. I'm getting goosebumps just even telling you the story. I choke up every time I tell it. So I ended up calling my editors and I said, "I'm not writing Carl Lewis." "What? Carl is the biggest story." I said, "I got a better story than Carl." "You can't have a better story than Carl." I said, "Promise, this is a better story." And I wrote that story, and nobody remembers anything I wrote about Carl Lewis, but everybody remembers that column about Derek Redmond. So your dad was 100% right. Losers are always more interesting than winners.
You guys are very similar. My father used to talk to me about the power of observation, and I read something you said. And in leads, if you're really good powers of observation, you will see and always look for something in the room or something somebody says or does. Instead of just saying, "This is terrible, this is sad," you look for the picture that tells the story. This is what you do as a journalist, and that's what no one else can do. I think you and my father both paid attention.
Yeah. Well, and what you're paying attention for is an act that symbolizes the emotion that you're trying to create or talk about. Your father did it more brilliantly than almost anybody else. And the column I remember in particular is the one about the man who was digging President Kennedy's grave. And that was such a brilliant way to write that story. Everybody in the country was writing about what this means to America, and here's the big significant, the assassination of our beloved president. And he went out, your dad went out and talked to the guy who was digging his grave. And he talked about how they got the dirt just right and the shovel, because this is for the president. We got to dig the right hole. That little action, of, you can imagine holding the shovel and I got to dig the right hole for the president. That says everything about the love that the country had for the president without ever having to be the voice that tells the people what it means, and if you can ever tell a story through an act where you never have to use descriptive prose for what you're feeling, you just describe the action and the action does it. Like that story I just told you, a father puts his son on his feet the same way he did it when he taught him. What else do I have to say? Nothing. I don't have to say this means this or whatever. I just tell that story. And if you find those moments, you've got a great column, and your dad did it, like I say, better than anybody.
Well, thank you. I mean, newspaper writing today, no one's Is it dying? Is it become so boring? What do you think? Can it hold up?
I don't know that it's become boring, Kevin. I think there are so many constraints now. First of all, the beautiful thing about newspapers used to be that you never knew why somebody was buying a newspaper. They plucked down a quarter, 50 cents, whatever. They could just as easily be buying it for the crossword puzzle as they could for the front page story. So everything was equally important, and nobody got up about, like, this thing gets more readers, because you never could really prove it. I mean, you had suspicion that certain guys were popular or whatever, but you could never prove it. Now we are no different than television. Television uses ratings, which has ruined TV news, and we use clicks. So now it's all about how many page views you get. And so at the Detroit Free Press, no matter what I might write, no matter what our best investigative reporter might write, the top click getting thing is, who is Michigan recruiting for the football team? And if there's some high school kid that's being recruited, that'll get 1 million clicks because it's got that kind of social media following. And so they end up putting the emphasis on all these click things, and very few people end up clicking on good writing. And so consequently, the emphasis is not on writing. And I have found one of the big flaws in newspapers, even when I got into it many years ago, and it's still today, that nobody works with you on your writing. You're expected to just show up with whatever level of writing talent you have. They'll tell you where to go. They'll tell you how much money you can spend or can't spend. They'll tell you what they want you to do. They'll tell you the deadline. They'll tell you all this stuff. But no one sits there and says, here's how you turn a good phrase. Here's how you work with the paragraph. Here's a great way to, conduct a dialogue in your thing. You got to figure that out on your own. And that's nuts, because that is the craft. That would be like hiring painters, but never teaching them how to use a brush or how to open a can. It's just like expected, how to do that. So it's not.
That's funny. You brought that up because my father used to drill into me, short sentences win. I don't hear anybody talk about that, or verbs. He used to say to me, dust in the air is where words live. They're not teaching journalists this, are they?
Your father once wrote a line: dies the victim, dies the city.
Yep.
Six words. Said the whole thing. The column about it was about a murder, but
Yes.
we're all in this. Every time there's somebody dies in this city, a little piece of us dies too. Nobody teaches you. Somebody should teach every kid who gets into journalism that sentence. Look, watch how Jimmy Breslin summed up violence in this: dies the victim, dies the city. Nobody does it. It's a shame. I mean, you and I are talking about it, but we're not teaching young journalists. I wish we were.
Mitch, you didn't go to journalism school, did you?
I did. Not early.
Yeah, not early.
I was a musician, and
Yeah.
I wrote a word. I never wrote a word until I started starving as a musician, and of course, in the inimitable way that journalists have of like going from one failed effort to another, I went from starving in music to starving in journalism. I was playing music, and I was in New York City, and I was playing at dive bars and piano bars and stuff like that at night. But I had my daytimes kind of free, and I happened to I was living in Queens, and I walked into a supermarket, and they threw a Queens Tribune into my basket, and I took it home, and I read it as a local, Queens newspaper weekly, and it said, if you have free time, we could use some help putting together our newspaper, a little ad. So I had time during the day, so I went down there. I was probably the youngest person in there by 25 years, and they gave me an assignment that day. I'd never written anything, and they gave me an assignment to cover a parking meters hearing, and on 108th Street, and why were they raising the parking meters 5 cents? So the entire extent of my journalism knowledge to that point was having seen All the President's Men. That was it. And so I did what they did. I got a notebook, and I started asking all these pointed questions. How come you're doing this, and how come you're doing it? And I went home and, I guess I've read enough newspapers in my life to know like the first paragraph kind of sums it up. The second paragraph's often a quote. The third paragraph expands it. So I wrote a story like that. And the next week, when I came to the supermarket, they threw the thing into my basket as I left. And there was my story on the front page at the bottom of the front page of the Queen's Tribune. And I got that little tingle that I'm sure your father told you about, and maybe you have too, when you see your name on top of something that you wrote, and it's like, well, I did that. And that was the beginning of my journalism career. And I ended up working for that newspaper for free for 6 months. I worked 40, 50, 60 hours a week, never got a dime, but learned everything, learned how to lay out the paper, learned how to get ads, learned how to write the straight stories, the feature stories, all the rest of it. And then they were so pleased with me after 6 months that they offered me $25 a week. And I worked for $25 a week for another 6 months. But I had enough clips after all that to apply to journalism school. And that's what ultimately got me into Columbia.
Do you think that young writers today, my father used to say, I still pursue the art of climbing flights of stairs. By the way, he did that into his late, almost 80s, going to the scene, go ring the doorbell and ask the guy. Nobody does that. Do you think reporters are hustling like they used to, the news writers?
No, they're not hustling. First of all, there's several reasons for that. One, it's more dangerous now, and people sue you, you're harassing me, I'm going to film you, you're asking me questions, I'm going to film you, I'm going to put it up on the internet, show that I'm being harassed by a reporter. So human contact isn't what it was. Your dad was a very, what's the best?
You got to circulate. He said you have to circulate.
Yeah, but he wasn't afraid to circulate, and he was gruff in his way, and he wasn't nervous about asking somebody a question. And I think people today, first of all, especially kids, I hate to say this, but young kids who are coming up, they don't know how to talk. Everything is texting. They don't learn the art of conversation, and interviewing is conversation. So no, I don't think they hustle that way. I think everybody wants to text somebody and can you give me a quote in a text? I never trusted a quote from a text because you don't know who they're handing their phone to. Hey, they want a quote, come up with something for me. They're not being honest. It comes back, it's like Shakespeare. I'm like, okay, I know this guy didn't write it. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that art died with your dad and his generation.
Well, you wrote a great column about a kid freezing to death in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, I read. So I think you still take a walk around and look at things. There's something that I admire you about. Early on, you were not afraid to say that Donald Trump seems to be on a collision course with writers. He attempts to muzzle the press. Trump's second presidency, the verbal bullying, the legal harassment, the buckling by media owners in the face of threat, it all looks very familiar. I mean, do you think Trump and the press is just going to be a very difficult run here?
I think there are two challenges with Trump for the media. One is to continue to do their job correctly because he is going to get in the way of every chance, from the press briefings to access to harassment to all the rest of it. And so good, honest reporters are going to have to try twice as hard just to get the same basic news. The flip side of it is that they are going to have to temper their anger at Trump, which most reporters seem to have, and try to write down the middle and be honest about what's going on in the country. And if there is something good that actually comes out of the Trump administration, to be willing to write it, even though it may be coming out of the Trump administration. Because if they don't, their credibility, which is already at an all-time low, is going to continue to sink with at least half of the country. And that's not good. And I know a lot of journalists today who feel like they can slam Trump, they can slam anyone who works with Trump, they can slam anything that comes out of the Trump administration because they're on the side of the angels. And it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, they're on the side of the angels. And so everything they do is going to be, and all you do with that is you become part of the lamestream media that everybody, you know, on the far right has adopted. Rush Limbaugh invented the phrase, and then everybody has just taken it. And if everybody ignores you, what good is your reporting? You know, what good is your column writing? What good is your editorializing if everyone ignores you and assumes you're on the take? You know, and that's what we've come to now. People assume that nobody can work for Fox News without being a shill. People assume that nobody can work for MSNBC without signing some kind of secret document that they will always pledge their loyalty to progressive liberalism, and nobody trusts them. And without trust, you don't have a free press. You just have a bunch of screamers, like you said at the beginning.
Well, you've never been a screamer. My father had a big mouth and could be tough, and he disliked Trump, but he was also objective enough to realize you tell an honest story. And what you're talking about now sounds like journalists that are scared, publishers that are scared, editors that are scared, and they skew it whichever way their enterprise tells them to work.
Yeah, that's sad, but true. And I don't think you should be skewing the news, period. And there are a few organizations that still try to do it, you know, correctly. But when you start to feel, well, we are on a mission, and our mission is to save the country from Donald Trump, you're not covering the country. You're advocating, and that's really hard to do because most of the time they may be right, but it's not the approach that you can take and be respected as an honest journalist. And if you want to be able to convince the skeptic that you are reporting honestly, and get that person to think, well, you know, I voted for the guy, but this is a pretty straightforward article. They got proof. You know, they didn't just talk to one side. Maybe I was wrong. You know, that's ultimately, if you really want to, you know, make a change in the world, you've got to do it through honest reporting and not by saying this guy's an idiot. Because look, people were saying this guy's an idiot last November, and he ended up winning decisively. So clearly that approach isn't the way to go. And as far as the screaming is concerned, I don't scream because I'm an old guy in this business now, you know, and I came out of a school of journalism that, you know, we were weaned on your father's columns and people who, you know, got out of the way of the story, let the story tell the story. They weren't trying to be famous. As famous as your dad was in terms of being a name, I never saw him or rarely saw him on TV, you know, spouting his mouth off or going on, you know, this show or that show and just pontificating. If he made appearances, it was because he was a rogue, you know, he was charming and people enjoyed kind of talking to him, but not so that he could get up there and say, you know what the problem with this guy is, you know, and now that's all anybody wants to go into, you know, and you know, I think of the journalists who are on, you know, the cable networks. I think of the journalists in sports. Now, you know, the ones that get the richest and the most famous are the screamers, you know, the loudest guys. I don't need to tell you who they are. Everybody knows.
Yeah.
And it's paying off. So, you know, my way of thinking, perhaps your way of thinking, is not the current in vogue way.
See, Trump said the media is corrupt, very corrupt. And I don't believe that. I mean, look at you. You spent your life with words and writing, and boy, you know, enormously successful. And my father also, and Dick Schaap, whom we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I think that the media is a very strong, precious occupation, a great job. If you believe in it, and my father wrote like a son of a bitch, morning, noon, and night for 50 years, and he cared about what he did. He didn't just attack Trump or anyone for that matter, unless there was reason. It was never just some vengeance. And I don't know why Trump has now flipped it where everybody in the media is corrupt and against him. I don't believe that.
Well, I don't believe it either. I don't think anybody sane believes it, but you
But
know,
no one's yelling back, Mitch. I don't see the press yelling back. I don't see them with any guts saying we're not.
No, I don't think that's true. I think there are plenty of people who say that, unfortunately, they end up saying it to the people who already believe it. And the people who want to believe that the press is corrupt are the people who want to believe what Trump says. And so you have to prove, that's why I said before, you got to work twice as hard. Every
Yeah.
story that you pull up, you have to ask yourself, can this be swatted down by the administration by just saying, they're corrupt? Or do I have irrefutable facts that we have to hold up and say this isn't corrupt because look, you can't deny this, and it's going to take that type of approach in journalism, unfortunately, at least for the next 4 years.
Well, it's going to be a very fascinating time with that. We go back to for sports for a minute. My father and you also had something in common. Dick Schaap.
Yeah.
My father loved Dick Schaap like a brother, and you said something very poignant about him. You said Schaap's life is packed with shortcomings. He lacked cruelty, he lacked greed, he lacked the ability to look at colleagues and say, "I hope they fail so I succeed." I mean,
Yeah.
Dick Schaap was like my father's brother, and you and Schaap go back so long with sports and writing and the whole game. And
I remember,
I feel guilty if I didn't bring that up.
I delivered one of his eulogies, and that was my approach, was to say, everyone here is talking about what Dick Schaap was. Well, I'm going to tell you what he wasn't. And you could hear like a gasp, like, uh-oh, this is going to be one of those moments where a guy gets up and trashes somebody at eulogy. And then I just listed all those types of things, all the things that he wasn't. Your father had the absolute best line about Dick. He said he was a friend behind your back. And that was, I've never heard a better compliment for Dick, or really for anybody else. And that's exactly what Dick was like. If you met him and he was talking about somebody else, he would invariably tell you their good traits. Whereas most people, when they talk about somebody else, say, "Guy's an asshole," like, let me tell you what he's really like. Dick would always say good things about people when they weren't around. And he was a joy to work with on Sunday mornings. And one of my fondest memories is coming in for the sports reporters, and he'd always be there first. And we got these bagels sent over because it was Sunday morning, like 6 a.m. We'd come in there, and the bag of bagels from H&H Bagels, they were hot. They were, the bag was hot. And they'd come with a thing of cream cheese, and you'd walk in, and Dick would be in there with a mouth full of a bagel and cream cheese, and it'd be all over his face, and he'd go, "More than this," like that. I Dick, and off we would go. He was a treasure, and he's missed every day.
My father used to say when you go out and cover a story, he'd be very careful. He loved to play the single. He liked to do everything alone. That way he could come up on a story and no one was around.
Yeah.
How do you handle it?
Harder to do if you're trying to cover stories that everybody's doing. That's why, the loser is always a more interesting story, because chances are you're going to be the one who gets it and not 100 other people who crowd around a guy's locker. The offbeat story, the offbeat angle, you can be singular at. But if your life is going to be press conferences, you're not going to get a story alone. It ain't going to happen. So, you got to be willing to break from the mob and say, well, I'm going to take a chance. I might miss what everybody else gets, but I might also get what nobody else gets.
Exactly, because my father told me I ain't going to get nowhere if I'm with everybody else. They'll drown me. I better go out on my own. If I'm all alone in a place, I feel safe.
Oh, you couldn't say it better.
That's how he looked when he'd go for a column. He'd like to be all alone.
Yep.
And like, how would you tell young writers today, like, to play that way? It used to seem he'd go on stories and I used to be with him and I think, what are we doing here? There's nobody here. Everybody's over there. And he used to say, I go the other side of the street.
I would absolutely tell people to do that. And it's the best way to get an angle. But you have to have a lot of confidence. Your dad didn't lack confidence. He thought he was a good writer. And I know it. I've heard him talk about it. And you need that kind of confidence to break from that crowd. The people who don't want to break from the crowd, they're afraid, like, well, what if I don't find anything? And then I miss this. So they stay with the safe, crowd of people around the one politician, everybody asking the same questions. But if you can go across the street and find that guy who's digging the grave while everybody else is writing about, the assassination of a president, you're going to come back with a better angle. If you can find that guy who pulls up lame when everyone else is writing about Carl Lewis getting the umpteenth gold medal, you're going to end up with a story that people are going to remember more and remember you more. But it takes courage, It took a little balls for me to call my editors that day and say, I'm not doing Carl Lewis, because they were like, what do you mean you're not? And, we got into a little bit of a tussle over it, but I knew I was right. I knew I had a better story. And you can sense, and I'm sure your dad did too, when you stumble upon a good story, you got it. I remember talking to a kid once about who quit a basketball team in the inner city, and he was a good player, and suddenly he stopped showing up. And his coach called me in. He said, "Yeah, he's got something going, and I don't know why he won't come in. He's just at home all the time." And I said, and I went and talked to him, and I said, why aren't you on the team? He said, well, I have to stand on my porch. And I said, why do you have to stand on your porch? He said, well, these guys keep trying to sell drugs to my mom, and she's an addict, and they keep coming around, and unless I'm on the porch, they're going to get her. And so he quit the team so he could stand on the porch. I mean, whenever they came around, he would, he said, get the hell out of here, leave my mom alone. And I mean, if I had just stayed in the gym, I never would have known that story. But if you go out and talk to the kid on his porch, you got something that nobody else has. So, I would absolutely encourage people to work that way, but I don't know if I'd be too successful. And I've got to wrap up. I got a radio program I'm due on here now.
Well, that was a great story, Mitch, and thank you so much. That's what I wanted to zero in on, going to the other side of the street. Yeah. It's too bad that Shap's not here, but thank you so much for your time, and admire what you do in Detroit.
Well, I was a massive fan of your dad's, and through Dick, I didn't know your dad well personally, but I knew him well through Dick, who every Sunday would tell some story or another. And, I'm happy to help keep his legacy going in any way, shape, or form. Anything you need, just holler at me. I'm here.
And also your contributions to things. Hold on here. We were talking to you because your similarities, and I know you got to wrap it up, but I caught you because you had him on the website saying Breslin with how he constructed a column, how he constructed it, and you singled it out. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating that Mitch did that. Yeah. Death in emergency room #1, and dies the victim, dies the city.
Yeah. Well, like a fan. So thank you for talking to me. And anytime you need another voice of an old codger in this business, I'm happy to talk to you.
One quick one. Has social media ruined it? You think you can't write the same way?
Maybe not ruined it 100%, but destroyed most of the infrastructure. And now the diamonds are found in the rubble instead of on the floor. That's basically it.
So you got to get out there and do the legwork, or you're never going to get it.
See you guys. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Mitch. Pleasure.